Hello there. Welcome, everyone. We probably will have a few people still joining us. My name is Terry Lindenberg, and I teach psychology at Lake Park High School in Roselle, Illinois. I was asked to MC this webinar tonight because I am currently the chair-elect of TAPS. And I was a member of this recent standards working group. Before we get started, if you could use the chat to share who you are, where you teach, your city and state, and maybe the best thing that happens to you this school year, that will be great. And it'll give people a couple moments to join as well. Ooh, yay. I love seeing some familiar names and faces, some welcome to everyone, some new names and faces as well. We invited TAPS members from 11 states to join us tonight to hear about best practices for advocating for the national standards, with a focus on contacting state boards of education. The TAPS committee picked these 11 states to focus on this year, given the amazing teachers we have in these states. A few housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself muted, but please feel free to use the chat or raise hand feature to ask questions. We are recording this portion of the webinar, but the question and answer period later will not be recorded. And maybe we'll also have a little chance to socialize for a few minutes and catch up afterward. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tina Thanasopoulos, who currently teaches at Prospect High School. She is also here in the suburbs of Chicago. She has been teaching advanced placement and regular psychology for 25 years. And she was the fabulous chair of the this current last standards working group. Thank you for joining us, Tina.
Thank you for that intro, Terry. It's so nice to see many of you. It's so nice. I love that we're all gathered here today and there are many familiar faces. Mine is just going to be a quick overview of the national standards for high school psychology. And as I look across the screen, I actually am very confident that the majority of you know most of this information because you're such professionals and are aware of the changes that have been made. So as Terry introduced, my name is Tina Thanasopoulos and I'm from the Chicagoland area. So high school psychology is extremely popular. We all know that. Besides it being one of their favorite classes, when you look at the statistics, about 840,000 high school students in the United States earn high school psychology credit every single year. More than 288,000 students took the AP psychology exam in 2021. So that makes it the 5th most popular AP course out of all of the AP courses in the College Board. More than 24,600 students took IB psychology exam worldwide, also in 2021. It's very impactful, as we all know. This is why we love to teach this class. It is something that is applicable to our lives. Some of the examples, it enhances our life skills. It can improve students' academic skills, their ability to work collaboratively, and just handle the daily challenges that they might come across. Obviously, it improves mental health literacy, and especially after COVID and its challenges with mental health rising, this is more imperative that our students are exposed to the content that we teach. It promotes cultural competence, which is very important because the standards use science to help students better understand the scope and variability of human behavior. The other thing that I think is most fascinating is there's an interest for students across a wide variety of careers. Think of our own journeys and how we ended up teaching psychology. We may not have originally started to be a psych major, but in the end, we all are passionate and we love the field. If we expose this content to our students, they can go out to a variety of careers and give back in all of the ways listed above. So even though we love to teach it, what we forget is how challenging it can be to actually teach high school psychology. And there are various reasons as to why this is so. For the first example, it's limited exposure to psychology content in teacher preparation programs. I remember when I was going to get certified in the state of Illinois to teach psychology, I also needed one of the cores, so I majored in history. But I was the only psychology teacher in the entire program. I was actually persuaded not to go into psychology. I was convinced, I didn't follow, but one of my professors like, are you sure? Why don't you just focus on history? You'll never find a job teaching psych. The other thing is a lot of teachers are from social studies backgrounds, as I mentioned. So they're they're less familiar with the scientific basis of psychology. They may have taken one or two psych courses, but because they teach social studies or social sciences, generally speaking, depending on the credentials of the state, they may not have much content knowledge. The other thing is teachers may be assigned the course with little or no psychology background. And without sufficient local professional development opportunities. I'm so fortunate in the Chicagoland area to have so many outlets of people that I can call up, email, chat with to see what they do at their schools. And I've had so many opportunities to have PD development because I'm in a highly populated area. There's some teachers that teach multiple preps, and then they're told they're going to teach psychology, and they might be an outlier in their school. They're the only one that teaches it, and they have no connections. And then the obvious broad discipline may have new developments. So if they're teaching 3-4 preps, US history, sociology, and economics, and then you throw in psych, well, how are they going to be masters at all of this? It's really, really difficult. So we are so passionate about our subject, but we often forget when we first get started, there's a big challenge for some of our colleagues across the nation. So the reason why there's a need for national standards is psychology to be adequately taught as a scientific discipline at the secondary level. There needs to be, the learning targets are essential. And this offers a type of guidance for those teachers that we described that might find teaching psychology challenging. In 1994, APA commissioned the task force for the development of the National High School Psychology Standards, experienced psychology educators at the secondary university levels. In 1994, that was the plea to actually have national standards. And as you all know, the revisions were in 2005, 2011, and then 2021. For 2021 national standards, we try and offer more choice and more flexibility for the regular psychology course. And so by now you're familiar with the pillar model, which also aligns with IPI, Introductory Psychology Initiative. The pillar model is where you have the 5 pillars: biological, cognition, developmental and learning, social and personality, mental health, and physical health pillar. It's the idea that we put an asterisk next to the content that we think would be something that if you only have an opportunity to teach one, we identify one each from the pillar or 1 or 2. And then with the idea that scientific inquiry and research methods should be an underlying overview or foundation of the course. So you're continuously going back to research and to critical thinking to have our students become better thinkers. It's integrated themes, as you can see, A through G. These also align with APA's IPI ideas, and all of these are applications that we hope our teachers continuously go back to. A good example would be B, psychology explains general principles that govern behavior while recognizing individual differences. So in all of those chapters in the pillars, we can identify A through G, and if we continuously do that, that's good practice. So we're continuously reviewing the scientific method. We're continuously reviewing the integrative themes. And if we do that throughout the entire course, regardless of how our courses are established, meaning Psych 1, Psych 2, or just one regular psych class, as opposed to a year or on block, we have the flexibility to teach our students the correct way. I think what's an amazing opportunity for teachers that are new, there are free resources to support teachers. And that's one thing that we really discussed, why it's so important for us to have this outreach. They're going to ask, well, where do I find this material? As we all know, when you go to the internet, you could do a search and you find almost too much information. So here, these are all vetted activities or contents, and it's also identified by the pillar. So if I'm looking something for memory, I just go to the cognition pillar and I click on the memory click, and then you can find a plethora of things there, as well as videos or activities. And you can see that on the right-hand side. So that is an overview of the national standards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina. Again, she was our fearless leader for this last standards working group. And I want to take a quick minute to thank all the members of this recent working group, as well as all the members who have, all the people who have served as members of previous working groups. I have a great appreciation for all of you. It is, now I'm happy to introduce Kenneth Polishuk and Doris Parfet-Claude in APA's Advocacy Office. Kenneth is the Senior Director, Congressional and Federal Relations and Education Policy Lead, and Doris is the Director for Grassroots Engagement. They are going to share some advice and best practices on written and in-person advocacy and storytelling. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, Terry, and thank you everyone for our time. So as Terry mentioned, we are going to be talking about storytelling in advocacy. It's a particularly effective way to communicate because it puts your humanity in the forefront. So really, we're trying to make you advocates who can engage with officials basically beyond just the immediate policy, to start building relationships and laying down groundwork for any other issues that might come up in the future. Goodness knows, reading the newspaper, we see quite a few of them. So, you know, the reason that storytelling in particular has become an important topic in advocacy overall, and we see it pop up just about everywhere, is that it helps to take take abstract policies and turn them into concrete situations. It also gives the officials or the audiences that you're interacting with opportunities to ask questions, make comments, and see how you react to them. The more they have a specific example, just the more they can find to kind of dig in and see how it could give them a read on the political situation that's on the ground, the realities that you're dealing with that they might not necessarily see if they're just reading an abstract. So it gives them a better way to understand how policy plays out on the ground. And the more they hear your reasons, not just beyond the policy, but your reasons as an individual, as a professional for caring about an issue and how it plays out in your life, the more they might be willing to either adopt your view or at least compromise with you. But it's not enough to just kind of go in there and start telling a story like you would if you're entertaining someone. The difference between telling a story in general and doing so while you advocate is that advocacy needs to drive a specific point across. So you need to give context. Why are you telling this story or giving these examples? The story needs to be structured so the audience can follow along without getting confused. And you need to connect the dots between your story and the reason you requested a meeting, which in advocacy terms is called the ask. All these things combined are called a pitch. So we're going to kind of walk you through how to structure one. We focus in particular on 3 elements: feel, know, and do, to help you organize your thoughts in advance. I suspect that as teachers, writing lesson plans has made you skilled at planning ahead. So we start with feelings, because focusing on emotions is a good way to pick what stories you want to choose. So for example, if you're trying to inspire awe in someone or wonder, you would focus on uplifting anecdotes. There's a reason that you get all those teary ads from the humane shelter when they want to adopt animals. They're telling you these like sad stories to tap into your sense of empathy. You can rely on emails or one-pagers or future meetings to round out the information, more on substantive topics later, but your pitch is, again, about creating a human connection. So that connection includes finding emotions and finding what makes a person tick, what they can respond to. Part of that is researching the officials you're going to meet and finding common ground with them. So I didn't look at all the Board of Education websites for the 11 states that are represented here tonight, but a few of them that I looked at all had member bios, and a few at least had the names of the members of the boards, which means that, even if you can't find a bio, you can at least look them up on social media and get a sense of their worldview and their experiences. Fundamentally, a story is about putting yourself in your audience's shoes. It's not so much what you're trying to convey, but how they receive it. So the more you can show that you understand their worldview, and start doing your research, the more you can also show how you're a relevant stakeholder in that worldview. So as teachers talking to a Board of Education, you're clear stakeholders, but in the future, if you engage in advocacy and other topics, you might also want to think about how your personal experiences, or people you know, or your community make you vested in an issue. And then you want to think about the key challenges you want the official to know about, which stories bring those to life. And finally, to wrap up the slide with the do component, you want to end your interactions by presenting a solution. It's not enough to just tell them that there's a problem. They'll want to know what to do about it. It'll make your meetings more impactful if you come with a ready ask, which in this case is the adoption of the standards. So I've previewed this a little bit already, but a good storyteller accommodates the audience. The specific audience of policymakers that you're dealing with have a lot of time constraints in general. So you want to keep things short. They might be running late to a meeting, or they might just not be reading your emails between a bunch of phone calls, meaning you might only have a few minutes to make your case. So you might have to make a snap decision on what information to share now and what information to save for another time. So organizing your information kind of in that pyramid style where you put the essentials up front and then expand if you have the chance is generally what we recommend. It's what we mean when we say keep it short. We also urge you to keep it simple. So policymakers have not just a lot of time constraints because of meetings, but general limited bandwidth. They're receiving a lot of competing demands from different audiences. So they'll have a harder time keeping track of a long list of reasons to support a policy or a long list of demands. You also want to keep your language simple and avoid colloquial terms. Focus on a few single examples, which segues us into concrete. Be they about yourself, a student, or your community. The more you rely on anecdotes, the more you make a talking point come alive. I know. So we basically threw like 6 different components at you. Feel, know, and do, short, simple, concrete. I know this kind of sounds a little abstract, so we're going to walk through 2 specific examples, asking for change and serving as an ambassador. We're going to play some videos that can give you these examples. The scripts with those videos are in the appendix. They can also work as examples of emails. So the first structure, the first kind of narrative arc that we want to talk about is asking for change. And with that, you'll want to explain the problems with the status quo, offer a contrasting vision of a brighter future, and help officials imagine their role in creating that brighter future. Changing the status quo is a risky proposition for officials because it opens them up to the unknown. They don't know if there's going to be an unintended consequence, if somebody they never even really thought to engage with is going to suddenly have some complaint and come out of the woodwork and make their life hard. So your goal when you're engaging with them is to make that change be less scary, which is why we talk about offering a contrasting vision. Policymakers run for public office or join government agencies because they want to do good. They might have a different definition of good than you do. Over time, they might become more jaded, but at heart, they engaged in this because they believe that the policy process can actually make a difference. And that's kind of the flame that you want to tap into and rekindle. So we're going to see a sample pitch featuring our intern Maya, and then I'll kind of walk through some of the components again.
I encourage the Board of Education to adopt APA's recommended standard curriculum for high school psychology. While the standards center around building strong scientific inquiry and research skills, they are also a tool to improve mental health literacy. I work with high school students. The teenage years are typically a challenging time in life, but the pandemic has in many ways made it even more so. Many students miss key milestones, time with their peers and their friends, and some have experienced significant loss. They are relearning to socialize through evolving friendships, and some continue to feel isolated. They face many competing pressures and stressors with college and adulthood around the corner. Many are anxious about making the right decisions for their future. The standards provide accurate, evidence-based information about mental health, which is critical given the current student mental health crisis. They are a tool to help students better understand their own cognitive processes and those of others, and improve their own well-being and interpersonal skills. Such skills can help students be more patient and manage their emotions better, which can lead to improvements in academic performance. Instituting the standards will allow schools to fully integrate a curriculum based in psychological science. I urge you to adopt APA's recommended standard curriculum for high school psychology.
So Maya establishes the context by giving a reason for the meeting, adopting the standards. She starts by explaining that the status quo is putting a lot of pressure on teens and causing them anxiety, both because of the pandemic and where they are at in life. So we wrote more generally because we're not as versed in classroom realities as you are. So when you make your case, you want to give more specific examples. I mean, obviously not your students' names or personal information, but the experiences of one or two students that would underscore some of the points you're making. Maya transitions to explaining how teaching psychology using APA standards would change things for the better, such as improving mental health, interpersonal skills, and academic performance. So that's kind of that brighter future that we were talking about in the earlier structure. And then you always bring it home with the ask. Serving as an ambassador is a little bit more of a personal approach. So you want to talk about your own examples, your career path, or your students' examples, but it's effective because policymakers love using real life stories from their constituents to justify their decisions. So just as you use concrete examples to sway them, they can in turn use those examples to sway their peers. It's probably something you'll see more in a legislative setting. I think in a board, they're all going to be hearing the same argument from you at the same time. But if they have other stakeholders to talk about or convince of why they supported a given approach, that's the more concrete examples you give them, the more they'll be able to use that in those conversations. So you being a stakeholder who has a concrete experience that they can relate to, so being an ambassador of an approach helps them in those kind of conversations. So in this video, Maya starts again by stating her reason for the meeting, but then she positions herself as a stakeholder whose experiences leads her to support using APA standards.
I encourage the Board of Education to adopt APA's recommended standard curriculum for high school psychology. I teach a high school psychology course that follows this curriculum and see its benefits firsthand, including its ability to prepare students for a variety of careers. Psychology as a field has broad applicability across a variety of disciplines, and a high-quality high school psychology course can help prepare students for several growing career fields, including business, education, health, criminal justice, mental health, and can be an entryway into other STEM disciplines. The curriculum helps students build a strong base of critical thinking, analytical, and interpersonal skills, which are among the top criteria most employers look for in their workforce. Additionally, considering the shortages of mental health professionals, an evidence-based high psychology course can be an entry point for prospective mental health careers. For example, after taking my course, I have had several students express to me their desire to pursue a career in mental health and to serve people in our community who lack access to such services. For many of my students, my class is the only exposure they will have to psychological science. That is likely also the case for students across the state if their high school teaches psychology. With your support, we can provide this type of quality education to more students. I urge you to adopt APA's recommended standard curriculum for high school psychology.
So here, Maya establishes a bit more context before bringing up her personal experience. She explains the broader educational and workforce values of teaching psychology. Then she makes those general points become more concrete by giving the examples of the students who have now become more interested in the topic and might possibly follow a career in it. Again, you would want to go into a bit more depth than what we gave, if possible. And then you'll see that Maya concludes by reminding officials this could be the case for other students across the state before again reiterating the ask. So both the examples we've shown you, again, these would work just as well as written or in-person pitches, but there are going to be some differences in how you approach the meeting depending on whether you're meeting or writing in. So, it's the core skill set that you're going to tap in, and the core way that you make your argument will be the same in both, but you'll have to deal with some different elements. Unsurprisingly. So now I'm going to hand the mic over to Kenneth so he can talk about those differences and what you can expect from meetings.
Great. Thank you so much, Doris, and good evening, everyone. Thanks so much again for joining us today and your willingness to engage in this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about some best practices and strategies for meetings with policymakers. As you can imagine, there certainly are differences between advocacy done in written form, whether through email or otherwise, and having face-to-face meetings, either in person or virtual. Both are powerful in their own right, and in some ways really can and should be done in concert with one another. So for example, you can send an email to a policymaker with a specific request, include some data and some information along with your story or your pitch, and still at the same time request a meeting. And should you get one, you can then expand on what you mentioned in the written correspondence when you meet in person. And really, in fact, that is the best way to go about this. That kind of gives you the most bang for your buck, so to speak. So like, in effect, we're not really, pitting one against the other. Advocacy done, whether through email or other written correspondence or meetings, they're not really mutually exclusive. And as Doris mentioned, many of the skills that we're talking about here are transferable between these different forms of advocacy. And so while email correspondence is certainly highly effective and really shouldn't be underestimated, the value and the power of meetings with policymakers are, pretty self-explanatory. So like, even if they do require a bit more work and preparation, connecting with someone face-to-face is, likely to have a higher impact. And I will also add that virtual meetings are really just as good and shouldn't be dismissed. We've had, 6 virtual advocacy summits at this point since the start of the pandemic, and we're actually in the process of currently planning another one. And all of them have been very impactful. Actually, if you take a look at some of the data that's been collected, this is mainly on, members of Congress and their staff. Since the pandemic, the majority of them are doing virtual meetings with their constituents and place a lot of value on them. And in fact, will continue to do these kinds of meetings, even as we're now beginning to move back into a situation where we are having more in-person, face-to-face contact. Next slide. Thanks. So, for the most part, these kinds of meetings are pretty typical and straightforward. At the end of the day, what you're trying to do is influence or persuade the policymakers to adopt your position. And in this case, it's the high school psychology standards. And the key is that you want to provide evidence and data as to why the issue that you're discussing with them is important. Back it up with a story or anecdotal information or the pitch, as Doris discussed, and try to present your request as a solution to a specific problem or an issue. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you all of this. Your educators, preparing early is something that's very much, I'm sure, ingrained in almost your DNA. But it is important to prepare for these meetings, not just to build this pitch, but also to really figure out a way to make it relevant to the person that you're meeting with. So as Doris mentioned earlier, doing some background research is important, particularly on what they are working on. And how what you're discussing fits into their work really is a critical piece of your messaging. So if you're meeting with state boards of education, for example, we know that the people that serve on them have an interest in education, but it's still important to get a sense of where their specific interests lie. If you can't ascertain their individual interests, what are the issues that the board as a whole is concerned with or working on at the moment? And really, how does your request fit into that? If you do have a meeting with a state legislator, for example, they're likely to have a much broader range of issues that they're working on. So doing some background research on them perhaps is even more important. They have websites, I'm sure, which have, information on their background and priorities and issues that they care about and work on. And if they do not have a website, I mean, at this point in time, any person that's in public life in any kind of way really can't escape, having some kind of, social media or digital footprint. So, I'm sure there's something in the press written about them and the work that they do that you can also look into. And really the main reason for doing this background research is to get a sense of whether there are any mutual interests that you may want to spend a few moments talking about, or in the case of an email, writing about. If it is a meeting that you have, just like any other ones that you may have, you want to build some rapport and, break the ice. And that really is getting a sense of who these people are, even somewhat, and what their interests are, helps in that regard. So, while we've spoken a lot here tonight about, building a story and making the issue personal, all of that is really critical. At the same time, we also want to make sure that we are presenting data as evidence to support our ask. There is science behind why it's important to adopt these standards, as Tina, elucidated earlier, and we want to be really clear on that. But without being, too technical or too jargony, it's important to use language that's easily understandable, without shorthand or acronyms. And really, most importantly, you want to present yourself as an issue expert and make sure that the person that you're meeting with sees you as a resource. And then lastly, it's also very important that you follow up after a meeting. Keeping that avenue of communication open is really critical to essentially getting, what you want at the end of the day. These policymakers, they have a lot on their plate. They're working on a variety of different issues. And so it's really the onus is on us as advocates to make sure that they, our issue rises to the top of that list. And follow-up is really critical for that reason. Next slide, please. And so just to sum up, you want to prepare for the meeting by collecting some information on who you're meeting with. Connect your request to something that they're working on or have an interest in. Back it up with data and evidence. Craft a story or anecdote as part of your pitch. And then follow up after the meeting, as quickly as you can, essentially. And then lastly, I will just remind you that you're not alone in this work. It could be overwhelming. I understand that, we just threw a lot of information at you in a pretty short period of time, but you have to remember that these things are conversations and you are the experts and you know this subject matter. And so remember that very clearly. They do want to hear from you and learn from you, but also we are here to help you. If you have questions after this session, we'll also, of course, take questions at the end. But if you have questions afterwards, we'll share our contact information with you, and please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any. So thank you again for your time and for really engaging in what we believe, and I know that you believe is a really important and critical work.
Thanks. And I think one last final note before we hand the mic back to Terry is that advocacy really is more of a series of steps rather than one single big action. So the reason that kind of put a lot of emphasis on relationship building is because what happens before and after you interact with an official matters just as much as like the single meeting that you might have with this first initial exchange. So think about this just as the beginning of a conversation, even if it seems like it's an important issue. But yes, other than that, thank you, everyone. And Terry, back to you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you so much to Doris and Kenneth. I know I feel so much sort of more ready to advocate for the adoption of the standards here in the state of Illinois. I hope you all feel more ready sort of to go at it in your states as well. And it makes me feel good that they'll be here to help us craft some messages and maybe bounce some ideas off of as well. I'm now so excited to introduce our last speaker, Dr. Amy Feinberg. She is going to share a success story in advocating for the standards in the state of Alabama. Roll Tide. I feel like that's a requirement if I'm introducing Amy. I'm not sure.
It is.
Amy currently works for the College Board as the director of AP Psychology Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment. But she also taught high school psychology for many, many years. And she is also a past chair of TOPS, and she served as the chair of the previous standards working group. So thanks so much for joining us, Amy. Take it away.
Thank you, Terry. So good to see so many great, well now names, but faces. And I'm so excited that you're interested in engaging in this advocacy work. Emily and I have been walking down this advocacy road for a very long time with the standards. As Terry mentioned, I was chair of the previous committee. And so probably for the last 2 or 3 cycles of the standards, I've been involved in doing advocacy work, both before I received some good training from the folks at APA that you just heard from, and then after. So I'm going to share kind of my journey and hopefully give you some encouragement and let you know about some potholes in this road, so that you can be equipped to do this really good work. So I started teaching last century when Tina showed up in 1994. That was my, the APA kind of started the standards journey. I was a senior in college and looking forward to teaching high school psychology. I was one of the certified person. I was also the only psych certified person in the College of Education at Samford University, where I received my undergraduate degree. And probably, as I look back on the history, I'm probably one of the last people in Alabama to receive a psychology-only certification. The certification is available, it's in state code, but colleges of education don't offer it anymore. And so this, I think this is actually indicative of what you may experience as you walk down this road. I'm sure your school doesn't ever treat you as, that weird elective where I'm sure you talk about like Freud and things. And so people don't really understand what we do and how much we are grounded and based in science. And so a lot of your work is going to be educating and helping people understand what psychology actually is and how it's effective. One of the side effects of the pandemic is, as we've mentioned several times tonight, the renewed emphasis on mental health and especially student mental health. And so being able to advocate for psychology in this way, you're going to have a little bit of an open door that I didn't have in the late 90s, where people really, really didn't understand the scientific nature of psychology. So what I did when I kind of first started this journey was I did my background research. I wanted to know, one, if we had standards at all in Alabama, and if so, how does one get standards? And so really grounding yourself in the knowledge of the process of standards development and standards adoption in your state or in your local area is key to this whole journey. Because if you know the process inside and out, then you are going to be able to know where to insert yourself along that process and know where the process is so that you can get what needs to happen. For my state, the State Department of Education is in charge of standards, and we call them actually courses of study. There is an actual structure that the state uses, and there's this whole process. There's like a committee of people from across the state, from each school board district. The governor appoints about 7 or 8 more people, so it's like a committee of like 30 people, and they do social studies one year, and they do science another year, and they do math another year. And so when I called the State Department, I called the person, I I was reading Alabama code on the early days of the internet, learning about what the process was coded in the legislature. And then I found out from the State Department who the person was who was in charge of standards. And I called this person and I said, hi, I introduced myself just like we were instructed to do. And I said, I'd love to get psychology standards here in Alabama. What do I need to do that? And the lady said, well, I don't think we teach psychology in Alabama. And so you're going to have to do some educating, because I've had that happen often when I call state departments. They're not aware of some of the elective courses that are being taught, or if they're aware, they don't think they're very common. And so you can kind of be like, well, I teach it, and I have 6 friends who teach it, and I know somebody in this other town who teaches it, and so you can say, but hey, we really need some standards. Another thing she asked me was, do you really want standards? Because then you'll have to be held accountable to them. And I thought, well, of course I do. I want to be held accountable to them. I want other people to be held accountable to them. And it will help make this course, be the kind of quality course that I know it can be. So be prepared as you talk to these people who have to really do a lot of things that they may not be very educated on what you do and what you know to be true that goes on in your school and in the schools around you. So once you find out what the process is, figure out how you can insert yourself into that process. So I found out that they had a calendar for when these standards were going to be done in a given year. I found out who the person was who was in charge of this at the time, social studies standards. I called that person and talked to that person, who was much more willing to talk about the state of psychology and how it worked, was a lovely person. And I built that relationship with her. And they very much gave me the, we'll get back to you. Thank you very much for calling. But what happened after that was that because I was building this relationship with this person, because I was making connections and bringing psychology up on their to-do list, about 4 or 5 years later, when the Social Studies Course of Study Committee was doing their work, they called me and they said, hey, can either you serve, or do you know somebody who could serve? The governor's looking for people to appoint. And so fortunately, I had created for them the knowledge that I was someone that they could call and that would give them good information about a subject that they had really little knowledge about. So you becoming that kind of go-to person for psychology in your state or in your school district or in, however your state or municipality or school board does these things is key to being able to then be in the right place at the right time or get the right phone call from the right person to be able to then get the work done. Knowing who those decision makers are and making sure they know you are the expert is just so key. Eventually, when they needed the standards kind of put together for the committee, they called, and I was in, the woman, her name is Dr. Nettie Carson Mullins. She's a lovely human. She said, I like the APA standards, they look good, but we actually need them in this format. So be sure you know what kind of format your state or district needs the standards to be in. It would be great if they would just take the standards booklet as published by APA and adopt them. But oftentimes they're like, no, we have our way of doing things. And so be prepared to be that person who can look at what the APA has put together and make it fit into the local version that it needs to be. And Emily is a great resource for kind of being a thought partner on that and working together to kind of help take what we have in the APA's national standards and make it conform to what you need for the structure that teachers in your state or in your district are going to have. So that's actually what I did. So ultimately, the psychology standards for Alabama I wrote them because Dr. Carson Mullins was like, I don't know anything about psychology. You're the only person I know who teaches psychology, and I know you are connected to the APA. So why don't you just go ahead and write them, and I'll give them to the committee and they can take it from there. And so that's what happened. And so it was just this result of building this relationship, being the person who's asking the questions. Every time I met with these people, every time I went to a state meeting, every time once or twice a year, I'd send them an email and say, hey, remember, I'd really love to be a part of whatever you're doing for psychology standards. I'd really like to see standards happen. And eventually they just kind of let me do it, which was weird, but cool. And I appreciated that opportunity very much. And I built some good reputation and credit. But as I kind of mentioned, and as our Doris and Kenneth kind of mentioned, this is a long experience. It wasn't that I called on a Tuesday and by Sunday we had standards, or that one meeting they said, oh yeah, sure, we'll adopt the APA standards. That's great. This took 4 or 5 years before we were able to see the results of the work ultimately get into the hands of teachers in Alabama. So be persistent, but also be patient as you go on this journey. Ultimately, knowing what the process is and who the decision makers are, forming relationships with them, making sure they see you as the person to call, and then being patient and persistent. All of those factors together will, I think, lead to success in getting something for teachers that is aligned to the APA's national standards in ways that will ultimately help teachers do what they need to do by teaching the scientific psychology to their high school students. So that is my story. And I'm happy to answer questions about that as well. I think, Terry, you're going to lead us into kind of the next phase, which I think is Q&A, and
Yes.
kind of talking through what some strategy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amy. That was honestly such an inspiring, right, success story. Like, I feel like I need to start researching how the state of Illinois operates, like right now, to get these standards.
It's fascinating in a very nerdy kind of way. You learn that there are laws about this, there are policies about this, and there are people about this. And so if you can get intimate knowledge of those things, then you can figure out where you need to insert yourself into that process to get this done.